A number of days ago, I was pleasantly surprised to find that my videos had reached enough people that they attracted the attention of some major history YouTubers. Brandon Fischella, whose channel focuses on 18th and 19th century military history, often through a social lens, inquired about the role of women in the Roman army. This video is the answer to that question. It's going to be a short one because there's not that much information on this, but what we do know is changing. Over the past 2 decades or so, the scholarly opinion shifted from thinking that forts and other places where troops were garrisoned were almost exclusively male areas with the exceptions of officers' quarters, and that all women lived outside the forts if they were present at all, to thinking that women probably did have much more of a presence and that soldiers often lived with their wives inside the forts, despite the fact that marriage was officially banned, probably under Augustus. In 197, this ban was officially removed, and in the words of Herodian, soldiers were allowed to wear the gold ring and live with their wives. We have scraps of evidence which strongly suggest that prior to this, Roman soldiers during the Principate were often married and often had children, but these were not officially sanctioned unions. These were very likely just common law marriages. That evidence primarily comes from diplomas, which auxiliaries would receive upon completing their service and which granted them the status of citizen, and many of those diplomas also grant the same privileges to their wives and families. Legionaries don't appear to have diplomas in the same numbers, possibly because they were already citizens, but just based on this, it's concluded that partnerships were something that were just accepted. After all, enforcing celibacy and a ban on relationships would have been almost impossible for a military numbering over 100,000 troops. In the 1970s, our ideas began to change with the rise of social history and the study of women, but there was little hard evidence for them. So how do you write the history of the forgotten? Well, what we have in the archaeology of the Roman frontier and Roman forts is the fort proper, and then some buildings outside of it. It was believed in the early to mid-20th century that these buildings were where women lived, aside from some evidence of cohabitation in officers' quarters, but more digging has forced historians and archaeologists to seriously revise this view because they have discovered the clothing of women and children within the forts. So things like hairpins, shoes, beads, which we know from other contexts belong to children's clothing, perfume bottles, and the skeletons of infants, specifically from the site at Brugg in Switzerland, as well as a couple others along the Romano-German frontier. And we have textual evidence such as the Vindolanda tablets, which explicitly mention families. We also have tombstones of soldiers, which have the dates of service, and the date of birth, and the date of death of the soldier, and those stones also have epitaphs recording that the soldier in question was a husband, maybe a father. Using those dates, we know that many of those troops were not yet retired, which means that if they were recorded as husbands or fathers, then they had women in their lives. The Roman army was explicitly a male thing. Women were not allowed to become soldiers, and by the 2nd century, when frontiers more or less became solidified, those troops were often garrisoned in forts where they often stayed for long periods unless needed elsewhere. In the surviving documentation, wives were often listed as peregrinae, non-citizens, but it would very likely have not been unusual for soldiers to have had wives or family of some sort with people coming from across the frontier as well, especially in the later empire. Marriage, whether officially sanctioned or not, was tolerated very likely because it was realized that a military with common law families but contented soldiers posed much less of a threat to an insecure emperor than an army which had the bans enforced, but which left the army angry. In later periods of history, women and other camp followers often did the washing, the cooking, things of that nature. It is possible that the women present in the Roman army did the same thing, but we don't have the evidence for it as of right now. That's essentially it. As I said, there's not that much information. There is one book, however, which does a serious deep dive and fully examines all of the evidence, and that is Sarah Fang's The Marriage of Roman Soldiers, but what I've attempted to do here is largely cram all of it into about 3 pages of script, so that's where I'm going to leave it. I would strongly suggest, if you're interested in the topic, checking out the sources I've listed in the video description. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you all next time.